All right, sorry about that. So, like we said, in the election, Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson actually tied for the office. And what happened back in those days is that the Electoral College actually casted two votes. They casted a vote for president, casted a vote for vice president. But back in those days, there was no ticket, so you didn't have Jefferson and Burr kind of running the same ticket. They're just both running. So Burr and Jefferson tied. So neither won the majority. Adams came in third place, by the way, too. Neither won the majority, so therefore it goes back to Congress to decide. If you read your Constitution, you know that it's the House of Representatives that decides. Well, at that time, the transfer of power hadn't happened yet when the election was held. So you still have Federalists in the House who get to decide who the president's going to be, because they still held a majority of seats in Congress. So there's a lot of debate, and basically the debate comes down to the Federalists believe that Jefferson was a lesser evil than Burr was, and so they decided to go ahead and pick Jefferson. But also, so what's also revolutionary about this process is that it shows that the Constitution worked. That you didn't have a president, but they had a system in place to pick a president, and so Jefferson becomes president after the House decides it, and then Aaron Burr, becomes the vice president. And so the new government takes over office in March of 2001. And so this election shows in many different ways our Constitution was working, and our parties and our system of government was working and could be very effective. And you see Jefferson, something I forgot to mention too, Jefferson himself was kind of behind the Virginia nullification resolution because he believed these laws were illegal. He says every state has a natural right to nullify. So Jefferson's one of these guys that kind of worked to undermine Adams while he's president, even though Jefferson was vice president at the time too. So that moves us on. Oh, and here are the election results. Here you see 1796, where Adams slightly beats out Jefferson, and here's 1800, where Jefferson wins out and beats out Adams. But you see here, most Federalists are up here, coastline up in northeast, and then you have down south, out west. These are the areas where the Democratic Republicans are, more the average type farmer. Here's Aaron Burr. Here's Thomas Jefferson. Portraits of them when they faced off back in 1800 election. All right, so Jefferson. By the 1800s, the U.S. will start developing the world's first modern mass democracy. So when the 1800s start, America is developing the world's first modern mass democracy, which was unusual for back in those days. There was none up to that point. And as the century begins, we're going to learn to develop and celebrate our own national culture. We're going to learn to celebrate and develop our own national culture, especially after the War of 1812, which we're going to get to that later in this unit. But you had that whole crisis develop with the president being the first place winner, and the second place winner is Aaron Burr, and it resulted in Adams and Jefferson having this whole crisis. And you had another crisis here with the 1800 election. So not long after Jefferson gets elected, you're going to have the 12th Amendment passed. That's the 12th Amendment passed, which is going to make it to where it's a current system like it is now. So now when you vote for president, you vote for a ticket. You vote for a president and vice presidential candidate on the same ticket whenever you run. So that's what the 12th Amendment does, is that it allows people to run a ticket and you pick both at the same time, not first and second place, basically. So that fixes that issue. All right, the inauguration. So a lot of people were fearful that there might be some kind of radical change when Jefferson took over office because of his viewpoints and beliefs. So whenever he became president, he gives a very famous line in his inauguration address. He says, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." So he tries to reassure people whenever he takes over office that he's going to try to make Americans work together by saying, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." He stressed the popular acceptance of basic principles of government in the Constitution, and he wanted to make sure that both sides kind of got something out the deal. And that's kind of the thing too. Jefferson, for all those years under Washington, Adams made all this outcry about things they were doing, but when it came down to it, he didn't really even govern like a Jeffersonian. He's still going to do some things that are kind of big government. So even Jefferson wasn't that Jeffersonian. Probably the most Jeffersonian person was like Andrew Jackson, more so than Thomas Jefferson himself, because when it comes down to it, when you govern, you realize that big government gets things accomplished a lot faster, which is what people do now too, right? Obama and Bush, and then now Trump. They talk about having a reduced government role, and then when they get in office, it's a lot of times the opposite. So some of the policies that he does, some of the Federalist and Democratic Republican actions that he does as president. He tried to maintain this relationship with the Federalists the best he could. He kept a national bank. He kept the national bank, even though he was not in favor of it. So he kept the national bank around. He also kept the debt repayment plan of Hamilton. So he kept the national bank and the debt repayment plan of Hamilton while in office. He did also carry out, or continue to carry out, the neutral policies of Washington and Adams. So by this point, Jefferson also kind of realizes that those wars in Europe were not the same as like the American Revolution. So he also goes and says, we're going to declare neutrality. We're not going to help France out, because France at this point is also under Napoleon's control, and they're not going to be a democracy anymore anyway. So that's some of the things that he does that are pro-Federalist. As far as pro-Democratic Republican, he kept the principle of limited central government by reducing the military, repealing excise taxes, those ones that caused the Whiskey Rebellion. And he lowered the national debt. He also tried to limit the amount of spending the government did and lower the national debt. He also was the first president to only pick people for his cabinet that were his own party. So all the people that were in his cabinet were not a mixture like Adams and Washington had, but was only his party. What's also something that he does, like Washington and Adams delivered the State of the Union address to Congress, but Jefferson does not. Jefferson stops delivering the State of the Union address to Congress because he was not a big speaker. He didn't like doing these big oratory speeches, and so what he did instead was that he would send out the letter to Congress and they would have it read. That was the tradition that was kept until Woodrow Wilson in the 19-teens, but Jefferson stopped delivering that speech to Congress after Adams and Washington had done it every year. So he does some things to kind of favor both sides, and he does kind of hurt the military, which is obviously going to hurt him down the road, because not long after he's president, you're going to have the War of 1812. But he believed to have a very limited military. He tried to put the Navy up like in ports. He didn't want them out to sea because it's very costly. He tried to reduce the size of the army as well too. Just all kinds of things that will come back to bite them later on when the war breaks out and there's not really a developed Navy or developed army as much as it could be. All right, so the first thing you probably know about Jefferson that everybody talks about all the time is the Louisiana Purchase. That his big claim to fame is the Louisiana Purchase. By 1803, Napoleon had lost interest in reestablishing France in the Americas. He had bought Louisiana from Spain in 1800, and he at one point planned to basically come and reestablish themselves, but that didn't happen. So for 3 years, briefly, France re-owned Louisiana. But two reasons why he decides to not pursue this. Number one, he wanted to concentrate his forces in fighting against England, because he's going to basically be fighting against England and other countries for 15 years or so in the 1800s, 18-teens. So he doesn't want to divert his forces elsewhere. So that's one reason. The second reason is because of the slave revolt in Haiti in the 1890s, resulted in France losing control of Haiti, their colony. That was led by Toussaint Louverture. So Toussaint Louverture led this rebellion, and so they lost control of Haiti, which would have been their way to launch their soldiers into Louisiana and reestablish themselves. But it doesn't happen that way. Our interests were in the river and in New Orleans. We weren't trying to buy Louisiana itself, because whenever Spain sold it to the French, we lost that right of deposit, and there were some trade issues on the Mississippi, because the French now were also in control of the Mississippi, and now they're in control of New Orleans, and they didn't want to let us trade there or deposit there for free like the Spanish had. So Jefferson sent ministers to France to offer $10 million for just New Orleans. So they were given instructions to go out to France to offer $10 million worth of money just for New Orleans itself, the city. But when we got there, they said, we don't want it anymore. You can have the whole thing for 15. And they looked at each other and what are we going to do? We don't have authorization for this, so they basically accepted the deal. So they, without Jefferson or Congress's approval, they said, all right, we're going to do this on behalf of the president. We'll make the deal and basically agree to buy for $15 million. So they come back to America with this deal to buy Louisiana for $15 million. Jefferson's very unsure about what to do with this because there's nothing in the Constitution about acquiring new land, only about making new states. So he's kind of, distraught because he's a Democratic Republican, and then it's not in the Constitution. So what should he do? And so he eventually decides, well, we'll go ahead and do it. It's basically it's part of the executive powers, the powers of the president to sign and okay treaties or create treaties. So he goes along with it. So the president, Jefferson, says, yes, I'll agree to the treaty, but it still doesn't make it official because Congress, as you know, has to approve of treaties. So the treaty goes to Congress and they make it official. And so in 1803, we officially purchased Louisiana for $15 million, which works out to be like 2 to 3 cents an acre, which is a steal. So overnight, we double the size of Louisiana as a result of this deal. So it had a few results. Number one, it removed the border enemy. So like we don't have the French there anymore, or the Spanish. Well, at least the Spanish are way out west now. So it doubles our size, and it removes our enemies. That's the first two results. Number one, it removes that border enemy. Number two, it doubles our size overnight. Number three, Jefferson got a lot of popularity as a result of it too. And number four, it also made the Federalists look weak because they weren't able to get this kind of deal done. And then as a result, Jefferson, of course, sends out these two explorers, Lewis and Clark, to go explore the territory. They go out west all the way to Oregon, and they meet Sacagawea along the way, and they just kind of explore the area, finding new plants and animals and flora, fauna, meeting Native American tribes and so forth. But they mostly just explore this area here. They leave from Lake Missouri and go up this area. But here you see what was America here, and then you see what Louisiana becomes as well too. What you'll also notice too is this little pink area here. That's where we are, like Baton Rouge over to like Pearl River. That was not part of the deal. That was part of Florida still, part of Spanish Florida. So they're still going to be separate. What's kind of interesting about this too is that after about 7-8 years, there's going to be a lot of Americans living there who are tired of being ruled by the Spanish. So in 1810, that little pink pocket right there revolts and becomes their own country called the West Florida Republic. And you look to the right of the classroom, I have the West Florida Republic flag. It's the blue flag with the white star in the middle. So for about 70-something days, the West Florida parishes, or the West Florida Republic, was its own country from about August 1810 until about December 1810. And then James Madison, the president at the time, decided to go ahead and annex us and make us part of Louisiana. But for a while, we were our own country. And we were also the first Lone Star state 25 years before Texas was. So there you go. That's not really something to know for the notes or anything. It's just a kind of fun little side story about where you live. If you go to St. Francisville, you see those flags flying all over the place. In fact, St. Francisville was the nation's capital for those 70 days as well too. And we had a president, we had a Congress, we had everything, right? So the Louisiana Purchase takes place. Jefferson kind of comes off, he's a hypocrite though, because he spent all those years saying if it's not in the Constitution, you can't do it. But as I said, whenever he's the president, he realizes that it's much more effective to get things done as you need it, so he decides to go ahead and okay the deal. All right, so that leads us to John Marshall and the Supreme Court. So a Federalist Chief Justice just took over that position before Jefferson became president. So in the months right before Adams left, he appointed John Marshall, who was a strong, devout Federalist, as the leader of the Supreme Court. And so John Marshall comes in, and he's the guy who's like going to make the Supreme Court what it is. He kind of looks around, it's kind of this ragtag group of people, and they don't always meet consistently. So he decides that the court's going to meet on a very consistent basis. He sets their schedule when they're going to meet. He makes them more, like, have more decorum by, like, wearing judge robes and stuff, too. So, like, he's going to help make the court feel more like the Supreme Court whenever he becomes the Chief Justice. But he's a strong Federalist, which is going to clash with Jefferson and later Madison and some of these other guys, too. And he's going to be the longest serving Chief Justice in American history. He serves for 34 years in the court. So he serves from Adams until Jackson, essentially, in the 1830s. So he serves for 34 years on the court. And he helps to decide in many big landmark cases we'll get to later on in this unit. But he also, the biggest thing about Marshall and his court, that he does a lot to establish the role of federal government over the role of state government. So he does a lot to kind of establish that role of national over state government over time. Okay, so the first big court case we're going to talk about, and I know you talked about this last year, was what's called Marbury versus Madison. So Adams is leaving office, and they're trying to figure out ways to help kind of keep the Federalists in power as much as possible. So they're like, hey, we can make federal judge appointments because the president has the power to make a bunch of federal court appointments. So basically, in the last few days of his presidency, John Adams is appointing dozens and dozens of federal court judges throughout the country. Not the Supreme Court, but like the federal courts. And not only appointing ones that needed filling, but like extra judges too. So he's appointing tons and tons of these extra federal judges. So like literally until midnight, whenever his last day in office ends, he's signing these appointments. Like they're in their office in the White House signing these appointments, which is where we get the name midnight appointments from. And then a guy from Jefferson's administration shows up, says, stop what you're doing, leave the premises, and so forth and so on. But basically, you have guys running out the White House this last day of Adams' office, like handing out these judge appointments before Thomas Jefferson takes over office. And then the next day, you have, Jefferson's left with some of these appointments. Some of the appointments were not handed out before midnight. So you have like a stack of appointments left on his desk, and it's like, Jefferson doesn't want to fulfill them, but they were technically legal because they were carried out under the presidency, and so he has the right to make these judge appointments. And so he kind of just like doesn't do anything with them. So Jefferson has these extra appointments that didn't go out and just kind of puts them off to the side and never fills them. That way he doesn't have to, give these spots to more Federalists in the courts. So what happens then is that one of the guys who is supposed to get a court appointment named William Marbury, so William Marbury decides that he finds out he's supposed to get this appointment, and he wants his appointment. So he basically sues the government and says, hey, I want my appointment as a federal court judge. And it was something actually low too. It was like a justice of the peace type or something like that. It was something very, very low, but he wanted the job. So he tried to get this appointment made. So he sues the federal government, and the person who represents the state at the time will be James Madison. So James Madison is the Secretary of State. So that's where you get the court case name from, Marbury versus Madison. And this court case goes immediately to the Supreme Court, which was also very unusual for now because mostly it has to go to district court and work its way up. But this is one of those rare court cases that start at the Supreme Court, basically. So John Marshall and his court hears the opinions of both sides, and they have to decide how they're going to act. Does he give a fellow Federalist this decision and win a short-term victory, or does he greater assert his power long-term? And William Marbury decides to create this process called judicial review. So in judicial review, he decides that the Supreme Court has the final say over whether something is or is not constitutional. This goes back to the Judiciary Act of 1789, which we talked about yesterday. The Judiciary Act of 1789 was that law that Congress passed to basically create the court system. Marshall ruled in this court case that the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional because it gave greater power to the courts than the Constitution allowed. So basically, this is what happens. Marbury got this appointment based on that initial act, the Judicial Act of 1789. But he doesn't want, if he tries to go in and make Jefferson do the appointment, Jefferson more than likely wouldn't enforce it because back in those days, the Supreme Court had a little power. So he's kind of stuck. He doesn't want to give Jefferson this ability to basically not do the appointments and basically hurt the Supreme Court in the process. So he finds a way around it by saying, okay, this act that was passed, the Judiciary Act of 1789, was itself unconstitutional, the way that Marbury got his initial appointment, because it gave way too much power to the government over the court system.
And that creates this concept of judicial review, that the Supreme Court itself is the final decider whether or not something is or is not constitutional, not the president, not Congress. So Marbury never gets this appointment, and Jefferson's kind of just, nothing really happens to Jefferson, but it establishes the role of the court, and at that point forward, you're going to see the role of the court take a much longer role going forward. So it's not a victory for Jefferson or the Federalists, it's a victory for the Supreme Court and the judicial branch itself, which is where you get judicial review from. And that's why Marshall's so important to our court system and our government, because he creates that process that we still use even now.